My name is Dawn Krim. I'm the Associate Dean for External Relations here in the School of Education. And I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming out and sharing this experience with us during American Education Week. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Dean Julie Underwood to you all tonight, who will then introduce our speaker. Dean Underwood has been the dean here at the School of Education since 2005. And she stepped away from that role to serve as the interim provost here for the UW-Madison campus in 2009 for a semester. She got her undergraduate degree at DePaul University, her PhD at the University of Florida, and her JD at Indiana University. So a lot of D's in Julie Dean Underwood. And so I just wanted to introduce you to her and let you know that her background and expertise is school law, and she holds a faculty appointment in the Educational Administration and Leadership Analysis program here in the School of Education. So I give you Dean Underwood.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you and your team for putting together a wonderful set of experiences for us for American Education Week. We really appreciate that, particularly this one as we start tonight. Thank you for what you do. And thank you all for being here. Those of you who are in the room and those of you who are beaming in with us through our webcast, we really appreciate you being with us tonight. And I appreciate and want to thank you for all that you do for education, for your dedication to education and your dedication to all of your students, those you have now and those you've had in the past, and those you will certainly have in the future. We know that this kind of cycles through, and it's a wonderful calling and gift that you give to people year after year. So tonight's presentation, as Dawn said, is part of our American Education Week series. I don't know if you know the history of American Education Week, but it was originally created by the NEA. In 1921, they started American Education Week, and they called for, and I'm going to read it to you, they called for an education week observed in all communities annually for the purpose of informing the public of the accomplishments and needs of the public schools and to secure the cooperation and support of the public in meeting those needs. I think it's important to us to think about that and to continue that kind of philosophy, trying to support public education and thinking about the community's role in education as well. So this week, throughout the week, we're showcasing events throughout the School of Education, and our theme is mapping routes toward readiness. And this includes tomorrow a talk here starting at 12:30. I'm giving a talk about politics and privatization in education. And our website also has all sorts of information and other pieces about education and American Education Week. And you can get there from our website, and you can also link through, I'll give you the URL. It's news.education.wisc.edu/AEU, American Education Week. But the main event tonight is with our celebrated author, Chris Lehman, and he's an international speaker, education consultant, and author or co-author on a number of books, including Pathways to the Common Core, which he's going to talk about tonight, and Energized Research, Reading and Writing, and also Falling in Love with Close Reading. Some of you know his work through those outlets as well. His articles have appeared in many publications and of course, popular blogs, including EdWeek and Smart Brief and Voices in the Middle, for those of you who know Voices in the Middle as well. Chris has been a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, a literacy coach, and a staff developer with Teachers College Reading and Writing Project at Columbia University. He now works with schools around the world as a consultant and, like here, a frequent keynote speaker. He supports educators, coaches, administrators in developing rigorous and passionate literacy instruction, of course, across the content areas. Important part. We get to claim him as one of ours. He's a UW-Madison alumnus. We get to claim him as a Badger.
Yeah. Yes, Badger.
And he's an alumnus from UW-Madison. Got his undergraduate degree in our English program. He has a master's degree from NYU in teaching and his master's of education in educational leadership at Teachers College at Columbia. His interests, of course, include child and adolescent literacy, school leadership, and, of course, the implications of standards and testing on instruction. So please join me in welcoming one of our own, Chris Lehman.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Everyone that's here, and we also are webcasting live to, I think, an equally large group online, too. So thank you all for visiting us from afar. Yes, I'm a Badger. Yay, Badgers. A few years ago, when my family, who's from southeastern Wisconsin, when we were here visiting my family with our two little ones, we went to the Wisconsin Dells. And then on the way back from the Dells, from Noah's Ark, we stopped here back at the campus. And that was several years ago, and I'm blown away by how much the campus continues to change. When I was a student here, I lived in Ogg Hall, when Ogg Hall was two very tall, horrible, large buildings with rooms that New Yorkers would think were small. And so I just kind of drove by that area this afternoon, and I was shocked to see it looks like a hotel now. I'm not quite sure what's going on over there, but the campus is beautiful. And I do want to say, I think the most magical years of my education were here on this campus. And I'm getting teary-eyed, so I'll stop. But really, the full humanity that UW-Madison believes in, that all of you believe in, all of you who are from here or are visiting here, I think there's such power here on this campus. And I walk with the footsteps of Badgerhood everywhere I go. So thank you for that gift for me. So we're here tonight exploring a route toward the adoption of the Common Core. If you know me, and some of you know me, if you don't, but some of you that know me know that I'm obsessed with Twitter. Twitter is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. So if you tweet, or if you're watching online and you're tweeting, you could use the hashtag that all of American Education Week all over the US is using, hashtag AEW2013. This is the handle for the UW-Madison School of Education, and then that's my handle as well. It's one of the many ways we can be connected after today. So if I say brilliant, wonderful things tonight, please tweet them and attribute them to me. If not, just hide them. So tonight, I first want to dedicate tonight to my wife, and here's why. My wife is an educator, like all of you. She's a career changer. She, years ago, was in private business. She traveled the world. She stayed in fancy places. She speaks 3 languages, so she was an interpreter. She did amazing work. And then when September 11th happened, she's a New Yorker. When September 11th happened, she decided she didn't want to cross any bridges. She didn't want to go very far. She wanted to stay close to home. So what she did is she went as close to home as possible. She approached the school that she went to as a middle school student and asked her principal, could I substitute or something here, please? And her principal said, sure, we need lots of principals. So we live in the Bronx. He said, yes, we need subs who will stay. So she started, and what her school found out was that she was excellent with the kids from the neighborhood that she grew up in. So she adopted the 8+ students, the 8th graders who should have graduated but didn't. So she did incredible work with them. She was able to look at them and say, I'm you. You can do it. And so she worked with them, and then became a teacher. She decided, I want to do this. I want to dedicate my life to education. And the reason why I want to dedicate tonight to her is because I think she has the story that many of you, I spoke to a lot of you before we started today, has as well. She does incredible work with kids that need it the most. And this is the first year where she said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. This is the first year where she said, I love teaching, but I don't know if I can do education. And so tonight, I want to talk some about that, about what's going on, what can we do, where do we go? So right now, it's a storm. It's kind of, I think I said to someone earlier, it's the perfect storm of terrible right now. So there's things like, here's from an educator that I work a lot with in New York State, who one of my posts on Smart Brief, Smart Blog, I quoted a letter that she had written, and she just said, can I just share this with you? So this is a little bit of her letter after a day of testing that happened in her school. This was day 2 of New York State's test. Boys who've known how difficult school can be from the very start, boys who've always had to work harder and longer than everyone else just to receive marginal grades, boys who've had to give up their summers to school sessions because their test scores are not deemed sufficient, boys who know what it is to be intellectually impaired and try their hardest despite their difficulties, these boys cried. I consoled them as well as I could. I promised them that doing their best was something to be proud of. I gave them time to compose themselves before they returned to class after 3 hours of giving everything they had to a task that they could not complete. I told them I would call home to let their parents know that they worked as hard as they could. When I left them in their classrooms, I talked to other teachers and learned that a student threw up, another child banged his head against the wall, and many other students across the grades could not finish their tests within the time allotted. This was a middle school. These were a group of 7th and 8th grade special education students that she was directly working with, but she works with students across the school. I thought about the 3rd day of testing to take place tomorrow, another 3 hours of a test that these students cannot read and understand. I also thought about these boys and their small heroic acts of tackling tests so far above their ability that to even finish them became impossible, and I cried. What are we teaching and why? One thing that we know is over the last decade since NCLB, so there's 99 and then NCLB happened right after. What we know over that last decade is that despite the over a decade of standardized testing and holding schools accountable, when you look at the NAEP assessment, there seems to be very little growth or change in the average NAEP scores in reading. That over a decade of high stakes testing hasn't changed that bottom line. Math has had some improvements in the younger grades on NAEP. What's fascinating to me as well is in the high school NAEP test, that top line, despite more than a decade of testing. I mean, high school students, that's pretty much all you do near the end of high school is testing. Despite all the testing, there's something going on with our 17-year-olds that change isn't really taking place. Inside of this perfect storm, other things we hear is that the US, there we are at the bottom, compared to other countries, is not performing at the level at which it needs to perform. But what we know, I think probably all of you in this room knows, all of you watching online know, is that the issue isn't just testing. And if we had longer, I could go on and on about the PISA exam and some of the errors and issues going on in it. But what we know is it's not just test scores. So here's United States that had 500. And if you go up to Finland, Canada, extremely high overall average scores. But another issue that's happening is this. If you take the percentage of students who are at varying degrees of income, so the higher percentage the school has free and reduced lunch, if you look at the most affluent schools, so if our kids who are middle class, upper middle class were their own country, they're actually performing far above Finland and Canada and all the others at the top of the list. When you look down this list, the higher the percentage of poverty inside of the school, the lower those scores seem to come. So an issue isn't just testing. We have the issue of what are we doing with our students in poverty? What's going on inside of our country? What's happening inside of the stratification that we have here in the US? We have things like this. If you take another comparison, the child poverty rate for the United States down here at the bottom is one of the largest in the developed world. Then there's perfect storms like this. So here is Bill Gates from the Gates Foundation that's poured, as we know, a lot of money into studying education, making some decisions about education. Here's one quote that he had back in 2009 that's gotten a bit of feather ruffling. Bill said to a group of state legislatures, when the tests are aligned with the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well, and it will unleash a powerful market of people providing services for better teaching. For the first time, there'll be a large uniform base of customers looking at using products that can help every kid learn and every teacher get better. Imagine having the people who create electrifying video games applying their intelligence to online tools that pull kids in and make algebra fun. So on the one hand, you could look at this and say, yes, great. Like that is one thing that's happening with the standards, is that people are able to come together around ideas in a way that I don't know we have had before. I can go to, this weekend, I'm going to the National Council of Teachers of English in Boston, NCT convention. And what's so fascinating to me is that I can talk with educators who are across the country, and we have a similar vision of what we're trying to figure out. We have similar terrible things happening, similar wonderful things. So on the one hand, you could say, yes, that. But then there's also this question of, so what exactly does Bill Gates mean by a large marketplace? Right? Like what is the goal that's happening here? Who makes wonderful video games? Xbox has wonderful video games, so does Microsoft. So there's some questions around, clearly, what are the purposes of the standards or initiatives around those? Throughout the evening, I asked my friends that are educators. I also spoke on my blog and through Twitter and asked educators to share what some of your experience with the standards. So you'll see some of these quotes as we go. So here's Sarah, who is an amazing English teacher at a technical high school in the Northeast. And here's what she wrote: "Dear world, I just want to teach, that's it. I'm a good teacher, but my life is being taken over by paperwork and minutia just in order to prove it." So where we are right now is a whole lot of terrible, right? It's the perfect storm of junk that's kind of happening around us. And I think all of us, like my wife, are wondering, how much more can we take? How much more can our kids take? How much more can our schools take? So what I want to spend our time this afternoon on, or this evening, is thinking about not just the horrible stuff that's happening, but the sorts of choices that we can make, the sorts of things that we do. Because I do believe this. I do believe that ultimately, every single thing we allow in our classrooms, we allow in our schools, we allow in our communities, are ultimately a choice. And people right now are saying, you, educator, don't know how to make the right choices. Or some people are saying, you, school, don't understand how to support your children. And I'm here tonight to say, I believe that you do. I believe that you have the power to make change because you've made it before. You have the power to learn. You have the power to find growth. You have the power to make decisions that each one of us inside of our schools, whether we're school leaders or we're teachers or curriculum coordinators or we're parents, we all have in us the ability to make the choices that our children need. So I want to start with that premise, that all of us are empowered and have the power to do what's right, and that we really can. So route to achievement, that's what we're talking about today. So what is that route? I think in terms of choices, that there's ways that we can go with the ways we lead our schools or the ways that we lead our classrooms. So here is a little bit of me being highly critical, and then I'll go back to being gently supportive and kind. So here's the highly critical part. So one choice that we can make is that we can take initiatives as written. And all the work that we do, all the things that we do in our schools and our classrooms can be based solely on the need and the desire to meet an initiative. So I'm going to say some disparaging things in a moment about my own state and a website that many states are very popular with, but then I'll come back and say some slightly nicer things too. So here's this. So Engage New York happens to house some instructional shifts around the Common Core standards. So this is something I'm sure all of you have seen a lot of. What's fascinating is if you Google Common Core instructional shifts, sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 10. There's kind of this wide range of them. So I do think, to just be kind for a minute, I do think when the standards were first coming out, everyone was freaking out and everyone was trying to figure out what do we do. And so I do think what a lot of states were trying to do was just help you with an answer. So to that degree, I don't think this is so terrible to say, here's some guidance, this can help you understand the standards. But what's been happening since the standards have been enacted, and as the rollout goes on, is these sorts of guidances are turning into, in some occasions, more of an initiative to be followed, a directive to get on board with, than a point of study and reflection. So here's a few things I want to point out in case you and your school are studying these shifts and are trying to align yourselves to the shifts. So here are a few things to know. So first of all of these things are interesting. However, they're not all in the standards. So the standards document themselves do not actually have all of these words. So balancing information and literary text, yes, that's a thing that the standards suggest. I think that's a helpful thing inside of our schools. Having some knowledge in the disciplines, I can get behind that. I do think reading and writing in the content areas is so critically important. And of course, let's help our kids be more literary. But then things start to get a little murky after that. So for example, having a staircase of complexity, which even that, I think that's what we all do. Right? Like, there's not a single one of us in this room or they're online that say at the start of the school year, I want my kids to read worse than when they came in. Right? Like, we're always trying to increase the complexity with which our kids read. We all want to get to grade level standards. There's no one here who doesn't want that. The part that troubles me is what happens on the right side of this particular diagram. Students read the central, grade-appropriate text around which instruction is centered. Teachers are patient and create more time and space and support in the curriculum for close reading. Now, nowhere in the actual standards does it say, children, every day of instruction will read one central text, and that text will be on grade level, and they will close read it. The standards don't say that. This shift document does. If you believe in that, if you think that's good instruction, you're welcome to choose it, but it's important to know it's not there itself. Text-based answers. Yes, the standards talk about going to evidence and talking off of evidence. But no, they do not say that the work that you must do as a reader is answer questions that someone else has decided is important for you. That's nowhere in the standards themselves. Writing from sources, sure, but that's not actually a main emphasis of the standards. And vocabulary is a part of the language standards, but it's not in all of them. So the standards themselves, the way that I think about them, and I'll tell you where I stand with them. I think the document is pretty beautiful. I think there's some trouble with it. I think there's a lot of questions around K2 as the standards were being written. We've learned since that there was no one with a K2 specialization working on the English standards. So that's a concern, right? That's something to worry about. But I do think there's elegance in them, and you're welcome to disagree with me. But I do think the standards make writing a thing that matters. Right? It isn't just writing that's a thing you do by accident. Writing is something you learn to do, you spend time doing. It's a process. Process writing, hallelujah. The standards are a shift from NCLB, where NCLB was about making sure that kids could do phonics, and more phonics and continue to do phonics. And the standards are saying, no, reading is actually reading and thinking. I'm behind that, I'm for it. What I think is helpful about the standards too, is that the standards are a set of habits. They're kind of a set of skills. They're sorts of things that students should be able to do by themselves by the end of a grade level. But they're things that aren't really a checklist for us. They aren't like, make sure that you've taught this once. The goal is that children can do these things by themselves, and I can totally get behind that. What I also think is really helpful about the standards is they come right out on page 6. Many of you know this, but if you don't, write down page 6 and underline it. On page 6, the standards tell you what they're not. And this, to me, is so progressive and thoughtful from the document. I think that this is a huge step. I don't know if I could do that myself. I don't know if I would start one of my books saying, you don't have to do any of this and you probably shouldn't. Like, I don't think I want to say that. But what they do is they tell you from point 1 on page 6, the standards define what all students are expected to know and be able to do, but not how teachers should teach. So the standards are not an expectation of what you should do in your classroom. It's up to you to decide how they get there. And then they go on to say the standards don't talk about they talk about what's most essential, but not everything. You should add to it. The standards aren't designed, this particular document, for advanced students. That's for you to decide. For struggling students, that's for you to decide. For students with IEPs, that's for you to decide. The document really is saying you have choices. You're able to decide what comes next. So how did we go from this to we're all pulling our hair out and everyone's nervous and what's going on? So here's, again, a little bit more of my kind of being critical, and then we'll move into some action. So what's really important to know is that these standards, this document, is not the only set of standards that exists. I think for many of us it should be, but it doesn't. In fact, there's more than one set of standards. Another set of standards is this. So if you don't know it, you should, after today, Google it and make sure you find it. So the Revised Publishers Criteria is a document that was created post the adoption of the Common Core standards. And I want to spend a little time on it because it's been hugely influential in products and pitches and work and initiatives that have happened since the standards. It's kind of another set of standards beyond the standards themselves. So the publisher's criteria was originally written by two of the lead authors of the ELA Common Core standards, Dave Coleman and Sue Pimental, who are both brilliant people. I mean, to create the standards in the way that they did and to have it be enacted in the way that it did, they're brilliant with policy. They haven't taught. Sue did teach, I met Sue. Sue did teach preschool for a brief time. Dave, I believe when he was at Yale, he headed up a group of teachers who did some tutoring in the New Haven public schools, but they haven't really been in classrooms. They don't really teach. So they took the standards and created a document that then describes what it means to be standards aligned. And they were doing this in order to support publishers. And if you're going to create materials, here's what you should do. Again, I think all of that is helpful. I think if texts and other things are going to be created, we should align those to the work that's going on. What's interesting is that the sorts of things that they suggest in this document in many ways go beyond or to the side of the standards themselves. So even in this first little page introduction, they say things like the criteria in the second paragraph. The criteria articulated below concentrate on the most significant elements of the Common Core state standards and lay out their implications for aligning materials with the standards. So number one, they're saying some things are more important in the standards than the others. Perhaps, but then I also would challenge, well then why didn't we write that to begin with? Why didn't the standards document have a big star? Number 1, 5, and 7, those are important. They didn't. These guidelines are not meant to dictate classroom practice, but rather to help ensure that teachers receive effective tools. Fine, great. I wish there was better alignment with the standards, but fine, great. But then if you come to the bottom here, they say things like, at the heart of these criteria are instructional shifts that focus of literacy instruction to center on, now think back to the shifts, careful examination of the text itself. In aligned materials, work in reading and writing, as well as speaking and listening, must be centered on text consideration. So this document helped to create many of those shifts that we came to. And what's happened since then are things like this. So this is called the Tri-State Rubric. Some of you from Wisconsin may actually have been a part of this. I know a few people from your state that have. So the Tri-State Rubric was a way of creating, and there was multiple states educators that were involved in it. It was a way of creating a rubric that school districts or states or others could use in order to really ask, am I aligned well to the standards? So are my units aligned? Are my lessons aligned? Now, if you look carefully at this rubric, and I'm pointing it out especially if you're a school leader or a district leader. I was just in communication with someone out of Pennsylvania who is a professor at a university there. And she said, we can't really figure out why a lot of our undergraduate education students are coming back to us saying, I have to teach close reading all the time. It's the only thing I can do. And she was like, we don't know what's going on. We looked in the standards. It's not in the standards. We don't understand. And I said, I'm willing to bet I know why. Because if you look at the Tri-State Rubric, what the Tri-State Rubric does is it talks about those shifts which come from the publisher's criteria. So if you look over here, your lesson is aligned to the depth of the Common Core if you do things like targets are set for grade appropriate levels of the Common Core standards. It includes clear and explicit instruction, fine. And then it says selected texts that measure within the grade level text complexity band are of sufficient quality and scope for the stated purpose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what the Tri-State Rubric does is it aligns directly to the shifts. Now, again, the problem I pointed out is the shifts don't align to the Common Core necessarily. So inside of this urge to kind of rush forward into the standards, which at first, like I said, I think it's valuable to try to offer some direction. What tends to be happening is if you don't feel empowered or powerful in a position of leadership, whether that's in your school or at your district level, what's often happening is people are searching for an answer to align. And that answer to align sometimes looks like this. But here's the thing, and I say this with confidence. A lot of suggestions that are made in these documents have very little, if any, research basis. Unfortunately, there's very little, if any, research basis to support some of the claims like kids improve their reading by reading texts that are at grade level, not texts that are at their level. There's very little research around that. So for example, here's this. I just want to try this quickly with you. So here is a text that I would like you in a moment to read. And so the text is written as if you're a student who can read with 80% accuracy. So that means there's 20% of this text that you don't know. And here's the thing. In almost any classroom in the United States, if not around the world, but in the United States, in almost every classroom, there are a percentage of students who actually do read at this percent accuracy compared to grade level text. And there's always a range, but there's always kids who read at a wide range. So I'd like you to try this out. If you could, with someone near you, one of you whisper read this text to the other. And every time you get to an X, can you do what our kids who might read with this accuracy do? Just pause. So don't try to figure it out. So you'll read like this. Let go, I say, because this is, okay? So I'd like you to read this text with 80% accuracy, and then we're going to talk about it. If you're at home, you can do the same. Okay, so try reading this text, and we'll talk about it. Okay, if I could pause you wherever you are, we could come back together. We could come back together. So, so this particular exercise, at least where I learned of it from, was from the work of Kathleen Tolan and Joe Yukish from the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. We had done this several years ago with other texts, because I think it's so important that we feel what our kids feel. Right? That we do what we're asking of our kids, so we know that experience. So here's the thing. I could do the greatest Common Core aligned lesson with you right now. And if I asked you to talk about this text, could you do it? No? Or you probably would sound like some kids in our classrooms that sound like this. There was this guy, and he did something, and someone said, let go, right? Like you kind of would stretch for understanding. So here's the truth of it. When you read a text with 80% accuracy, you're not reading, you're guessing. Bottom line, you're not actually reading. So also think, you just did this for what, like 30 seconds? Now imagine that you're a child in a classroom who perhaps is told we need to read grade level complex text all the time, and you can't read grade level complex text with any percentage of accuracy. And you have that text every single day of school and at home for homework, night after night, day after day. What is your relationship to reading? What is your reading achievement? And how much of my instruction can you apply to the work that we do? None, right? Now, if I highly supported you, if we did it together, if we did it in kind of the ways that, and I love my schooling, I've come from my schooling, but many times in my English classes, I felt like this. And oftentimes what would happen is the teacher would really talk about the text, and everyone would talk about the text, and so I could just listen. I didn't actually have to work on my reading at all. So this text that you just read is from the Hunger Games. I don't know if you knew that. So the text you just read goes something like, let go, I say harshly, because this is upsetting me and I don't want to cry. When they televise the replay of the reapings tonight, everyone will make note of my tears and I'll be marked as an easy target, a weakling. I will give no one that satisfaction. Let go. I can feel someone pulling her from my back. I turn and see Gail has lifted Prim off the ground and she's thrashing in his arms. Up you go, Catnip, he says in a voice he's fighting to keep steady, and then he carries Prim off towards my mother. So how do we support kids in getting to those levels of text that we need to get to? Well, number one, many of you in this room, you know those answers, right? Like that's what you've studied, that's what your life has been, that's what you dedicate yourself to. There's reading specialists here and English teachers and elementary school teachers. You work for that. So one of those things that moves you into higher levels of reading is reading, right? You only get good at the things that you do. So you have to read more. There's 3 times during the year where reading levels tend to drop. So I want to say these because I think it's really helpful to think about this in our classrooms. Those 3 times that reading levels tend to drop during the year are, one of which you can probably guess, the summer, right? Then there's 2 more. During long nonfiction studies, oftentimes we've seen kids' reading levels drop, and during test prep. So when I was working with the Reading and Writing Project, we'd done longitudinal studies across several years of looking at students' data points, looking at their test scores versus their reading level growth. And when you notice a dip like that, you say, well, why? And so when you look at classroom practice during the summer and during nonfiction and during test prep, what you tend to find is kids are either not reading, or they're reading texts that are too hard for them, or their volume of reading is incredibly low. It's one of those things that we began having the recommendation that during a nonfiction study, if your kids tend to read in a higher volume with narrative reading, you should have them read some narrative too. Right? So knowing that helps us make decisions. When you read text that you can't read and you're only guessing, your reading level doesn't stagnate, it tends to go backwards. That you actually drop reading levels. So during test prep, when we want our kids' reading levels to go up, if they're actually going down, we're doing anti-test prep. It's actually the exact reverse. So when we think about the standards, I want to frame some of these decisions and choices and initiatives that are happening in this way. The Brown Center at the Brookings Institution every year has their report on American education. And in 2012, they kind of looked into the crystal ball and tried to talk some about what will the standards do for our schools. And the way that they did this study, and it's not perfect, there's some issues with it, but the way that they took on this study is they looked historically at other standards in the country, at other ways that standards had been enacted. And here's what they found. Number one, that historically, the quality of state standards has no effect on student achievement. They compared the Fordham Institute that does those annual or semi-annual ratings of state standards, and they compared those ratings to student achievement in those states, and there was very little correlation, if any at all. Cut score placement, which all of our states obsess about, right? The amount of politics that goes into cut scores is sometimes maddening. And it turns out that historically, cut score placement had, historically, no relationship to achievement. Standards showed little historical ability to mitigate achievement variation in different subgroups. They also found that if the standards are talking about aligning states to each other, they said, well, wait a minute, the real problem isn't state to state. The real problems are sort of what we looked at earlier with income, is looking at areas inside of a state. They said that within state differences are greater than across state differences. Or another way they talked about that was that you could take Missouri and Illinois, and it's not that there's Missouri and Illinois average differences, it's that there's little tiny Missouris and Illinois differences within any one state. So ultimately they came to this. The empirical evidence suggests that the Common Core will have little effect on American students' achievement. The nation will have to look elsewhere for ways to improve its schools. So good night, everybody. We're done, thanks. So here's what I really think they're saying here. What they're saying is something that I do believe. And I think that the standards, like I said, I think the standards document are at least better than New York State's, or probably better than Wisconsin's. I think they're better than many states had before. But what they're saying is that the standards aren't going to make or break our kids' achievement. Instead, it's you. It's us. It's what we do. Instead, it comes down to our choices. So one choice we can make as we're moving forward in the standards, this route that we go on, is it could be about initiatives. Michael Fullen has this great quote about organizational change and school change. He said, organizations and schools rise and fall not on will, but on trying to take on too many initiatives all at once and doing all of them poorly. Right? Raise your hand if that feels familiar to you, right? He said that instead, what powerful organizations and schools do as they enact change is they have a small focus on a few strengths, and they try to make those strengths better. So I'd say the strengths inside of our schools are our kids. And the choice that I want to suggest to you this evening is that we're either deciding to do initiatives based on initiatives, or we're deciding to lead instruction based on our kids. So let's move to some ways we can help with that. Here's Melanie, a friend of mine from Twitter. Our students drive our instruction and the pathway to achievement of the Common Core standards. It's by engaging them, inspiring them to care about their learning and wonder about their world, asking and answering complex and meaningful questions. So the words that I found myself coming to more recently are ones like these, that the route to achievement is doing. I believe that the standards, at least achievement inside of this set of standards or any set of standards, is really about doing. It's the more our kids read and write inside of these ideas, the stronger they become. The more that we do with them, the more study we have with the standards, and frankly with each other, those are the sorts of things that push us forward. So what I want to suggest is that the standards are really about doing. I want to tell you a story. Alex Sheen, in 2011, his father, Al, was diagnosed with cancer. And Alex had a really successful career in the technology world, and he was crushed by this terrible news. And when his father died a little more than a year after that, he really struggled with how he would eulogize his dad at the funeral, how he'd kind of deal with his dad's passing. And one thing that Alex said was, you know what? My dad was ordinary. He said, my dad was kind of like any dad. He said, the thing that made my dad special was that he made a promise and he stuck with it. So what Alex did is he started this small little group. It started out as just him at the funeral, and then it became a larger nonprofit. You can find it at becauseIsaidso.com, becauseisaidiwould.com. He, at the funeral, handed out little cards like these. And he said to everyone there, I want you, before you go, to write on this card something that you promised to do. And it could be a huge promise. It could be something you want to change in your life. It could be a small thing. I promise to move my car on time. Whatever it is, it's something you promised to do. Give that card to someone else. And when you fulfilled that promise, ask for it back. So it started as this small gesture in Alex's life, has grown into this huge phenomenon. So there's things like people saying, I'll sincerely compliment one person every day, and handing that card out. In 2013, I will tackle my fear of needles and donate blood for the first time. Or there's ones like this. Here's a gentleman that when he was 5 was diagnosed with leukemia, and he had lived most of his life battling that disease. And so he wrote on this card as a young man, I promise to become the best oncologist that I can be, as he moved into medical school. Or there's this one. This is a war veteran, a Marine Corps vet, who had several years before writing this card had gone into remission with brain cancer. He was told that he was cured. And so I believe it was, I think I have it as May of that year, he wrote this card, I will defeat brain cancer again. And he sent it to Alex, said, I'm going to do it. That was in May. In June, he passed away. And when Alex talks about this particular one, what he says resonates so much with the work that we're all doing here. He said, you know what? There are some promises that you'll die trying to keep. There's some promises that you'll fight to your very last breath. And it doesn't mean that you didn't keep your promise. It means that you kept fighting for it. So as we're thinking about the steps that we're taking, I think we have to decide what promises do we want to make to our kids. So I want to share some promises with you. So if the standards are about doing, one promise I want to make is that I promise to students, I promise to learn about you and build my curriculum in your honor. A few months ago in New York State, you can get a discount on your car insurance if you take an online driving course. So I took an online driving course. And the state standard around online driving courses is that the online driving course must be 6 hours. That's pretty much the only standard, but that's the standard. Must be 6 hours. So years before that, I took another driving test, and it was painful, or driving course. It was painful, but I got through it. So this year, I took a different one. And based on the state standard of 6 hours, here's how this particular test dealt with the way that they worked. There was a little timer on every slide, and you could only move past that slide when the timer ran out. This slide I was supposed to stare at for 1 full minute. And then this one for another full minute. Here's the problem. I, as the student in this course, I read very quickly. I skim for information fast. This course was not meeting my needs. Now, and this is totally going to get this taken away from me, so please, everyone online, just black out this part. I didn't pay attention to it after a while. I opened up email, and I opened up other work, and I just had it there. And then every once in a while, I'd check it and go, oh, there's 3 seconds left, and I'd change it. I didn't retain information that I learned. I didn't stay connected to it, because this was built not for me, but was built off of just a standard. The expectation wasn't that they were building this for a learner. They were building this in order to meet a particular point of view or perspective, which in this case was a 6-hour test. So when we're teaching our students, one thing that we write about in Pathways to the Common Core and is really, I think, has been so transformational, I know, to me in my practice, and I know many teachers, is before you begin to teach, you could look at the standards as you're deciding what are you teaching today, or you can ask your students to show you what they already know about the thing that you haven't taught yet. And it's hugely transformational for our practice and for them. So you say to your student, can you, before we teach this essay, write an essay? And I'm not even going to grade it. Instead, I want to see what you already know and are able to do so that I can make decisions about my teaching after. I can then look at the standards and say, well, what are things that you do or you need to do? Before you begin reading fiction, I can ask you to read a little bit of fiction, or I could read a little fiction to you and jot down some of your thinking, like maybe write about the characters, write about some word choice that you're paying attention to. Let me know what you already know. So then my curriculum isn't built just around initiatives. It's really built around what I know about you. Here's a kindergarten teacher who, while they, near the start of the year, were working on their narratives. They were trying to tell stories in booklets. Those of you that don't teach K1 or 2 are like, what is that? But this means something. I swear to you, it means something. So this young man wrote his story. So he had a little booklet, and he wrote a story in it. So his teacher looked at the book and said, I have no idea what that says. What she learned about him is that he knew how a booklet worked, right? Like he kind of had a beginning, middle, and end. And she knew that he knew you're supposed to do something in that box. But what he couldn't do very well was represent anything with any sort of clear understanding. So what was her lesson with him? What conference did she have? She could have looked at the standards and said, well, one thing we have to work on is, having a moment that has multiple parts inside of it, and you can say it out loud or with me, so can you right now tell that moment, I'll help you do the parts. No, instead she said, my curriculum is you. So she looked at this and said, he really needs to work on how he draws people. That's what he needs. There's no way and I was there when this happened. She said, well, can you tell this story to me? And he didn't even know it. He was like, there's people and stuff around. So what she knew was if she helped him represent people more clearly, it would help him retain his story, but also become a better writer of stories. So her entire lesson with him was around creating better people. So there he is. He put a body. I thought her lesson was brilliant. She said, so people are shapes. Everything's a shape. So let's figure out some shapes. And he was like, oh, oval, circle, and so he made a shape. So that was built around him. Here's another example. This is one of my favorite pieces of student work from my book on research. This is a middle schooler. What I'd like to do right now is have you imagine that you asked her to write an essay for you. I'm going to read this beginning of her essay, and I'd like you to tell someone near you, what does she already know about essay writing? What are the things that she's really good at that we could build on? And if you want to say one or two things she could work on, fine. But let's start with, just like Michael Fullen said, let's start with some strengths. So here is the opening to her essay, V is for vegetarian. It's my absolute favorite. A few of you have seen this before. I love it. Remember that field trip to the farm in second grade? How you petted the friendly lamb? Or when you and your friends mooed at that silly cow? Yep, those are the same exact animals that might be on your dinner plate tonight. Vegetarianism is the practice of not eating meat, where you eat fruits, vegetables, nuts, and anything not meat-related instead. A stricter form of vegetarianism is veganism, where you avoid meat and anything animal-related, like honey, which is related to bees, or dairy products, which is related to cows and other animals. I think more people should become vegetarian. It's eco-friendly, animal-friendly, and health-friendly, making it a win-win-win situation. I myself want to go vegetarian, but unfortunately, I'm not in total control of my life right now, and my mom won't let me. But I'll show her and all the other meat eaters of the world that meat doesn't equal survival. So could you imagine you've asked for an essay? This is what you've got. She could go to Madison, right? Like she's like, yes. So you've got this essay. Can you just quickly talk to someone next to you? So starting with her first, not the standards first, not the textbook first, not the initiative first, starting with her first, what are some strengths that you see she has around essay writing? What might be next for her in your instruction? Go ahead, talk to someone near you. So we can come back together. So there's two critical actions happening here, two things that I think are so essential to the route that we're taking for our kids' achievement. Number one is you're starting with kids, right? Like number one, you're saying, what do you do already that I can help you build on? Number two, you're working together to talk about it. In Michael Fullen and Andy Hargrave's book, Professional Capital, if you don't have it, get it. Professional Capital, they talk about kind of like the future of education. Where should we go next? And one thing that they argue for is that we, all of us, need to continue to make this profession a profession. They're kind of like, stand up and do something, people. And what they do in their book is they talk about these ways that any profession improves itself in the way that we can too. And one of their arguments, there's three main arguments, and one of them is that we absolutely need more collaboration. The schools that grow are the ones that are a community together figuring out kids. So it's not enough that we look at kid work. It also is that we're talking together about it. Because here's the thing. There's a lot of ways to look at kid work. Some of you have shared some of those with me when you came in this morning. One way to look at kid work is to actually ask kids to do something and look at it. Or another way to get kid work is to pay some vendor to make a test that you can take, and then that test spits out data sheets, and then together you look at those data sheets, and then all the numbers help you figure something out. Or to have data binders. Some schools have those. We're collecting lots of numbers and information on kids. There's two problems with data. Data can be great, but data can be horrible. The two problems with data are data's only good for a short amount of time, right? Kids change. If you use this year's test scores more than a month or two from now, they're not really useful anymore, other than maybe looking at trends. And number two, data's only good if you do something with it. So looking at kid work and talking about it, the conversations you had right now, I'm willing to bet many of you came up with teaching ideas or suggestions or things that you could do that can now be added to your practice. It doesn't take a long conversation with tons and tons of data to figure out next steps. So here's another quote. Here's Susan, who does a lot of work with teachers groups and groups of teachers, bringing them together. And she writes, "We teach with respect for our communities and our students. We teach with an eye on the beauty and fierceness of the human experience. We teach with deference to a stunningly diverse and complex earth. No amount of testing should deter us from providing enriching learning experiences for our students." Amen. So if one promise that we can make in this doing, this enacting the standards, is that we're going to learn about you, the student. We're going to find what you need and build from there. Another, and this is a promise that it almost feels like we don't have to make, but I think in our world we're in now we do, is that I promise to teach you. Not over you, not near you, not around you. I promise to teach you the ways that you need to be taught. So here's an example. This is a group, it's called Achieve the Core. It was started by Dave Coleman and Sue Pimental and a group of other teachers. And they were trying to put together some exemplars of ways that you teach for the standards. And again, I think they were some of the first people that were like, look, we got to help people with this. I don't fault them for that. Like, I think they were right on. Like, we can't just say, meet the standards. Like, we really have to help people think about it. The struggle I have with some of this work is that it again tends to align to not just the standards, but to shifts and publishers' criteria. And so I want to use this as an example of a way that we can kind of teach one version of the standards, which some of you possibly in this room, and I know quite a few of you that are watching online, are teaching things that look like this. Like this is, you can find this on engagenewyork.com. You can find this on achievethecore.com. Pearson has made a program that somewhat looks like this. Scholastic has made a program that looks somewhat like this. Core Knowledge has made a program that looks somewhat like this. A lot of textbook companies are kind of following those instructions. So what you're told here in this first part, we'll do just a little of it, is that there's 5 days of using the same text over and over and over again. It's the Great Fire. We're going to use it multiple days. And so step one is the teacher will share the passage with minimal commentary, and students will read the passage independently. Now, we already talked about that this evening. There's a percentage of kids that will be successful for and a percentage that won't. Teacher or a skillful reader then reads the passage out loud. And then step three, you discuss a series of text-dependent questions. So here's the work. So I could ask you to read The Great Fire to yourself. This is for 6th grade. This one was written by a high school teacher, but it's for 6th grade. So let me read just a little bit. And can you think of 11-year-olds in your life that you know, or maybe your 6th grade teacher? Think about what they'd be thinking as they read this. It was Sunday. So here you are at your seat. I'm minimal introduction. You're now reading the text. It was Sunday and an unusually warm evening for October 8th, so Daniel Pegleg Sullivan left his stifling little house in the west side of Chicago and went to visit neighbors. One of his stops was at the shingled cottage of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. The one-legged Sullivan remembered getting to the O'Leary's house at around 8 o'clock, but left after only a few minutes because the O'Leary family was already in bed. Both Patrick and Catherine had to be up the very early in the morning. He set off for his job as a laborer, she to milk 5 cows and then deliver the milk to the neighbors. Sullivan ambled down the stretch of land between the O'Learys and their neighbor, across the street and sat down on the wooden sidewalk in front of the Thomas White House, and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. Now, I will tell you, a fire starts at one part. You have to wait a couple paragraphs, but a fire starts. And it gets really exciting, but until you get to that fire part, you're kind of dealing with this archaic language. You're kind of trying to muddle through as you go. So you read that alone, then I read that to you, and then we go into text-dependent questions. So here's my main point, is this like work around text-dependent questions. To me, text-dependent questions are good quizzes. They're good for finding out what you know, but quizzing isn't teaching. So the text-dependent questions are things like this. We've now read, and then I say to you, the title of the text is The Great Fire. In the first sentence, what words does Murphy use to hint at the tragedy to come? Go. So then you do it. And then the guidance from this is, students should notice that the evening is unusually warm, and the house is described as stifling. The meaning of stifling can be inferred using the details about the temperature and Sullivan's decision to go out for a visit. I know very few 6th graders that would do that, but all right, fine. So what I want to make here, and it kind of goes on and on to this, is that I don't mean this as a knock just on this particular group. Again, I think they were trying to make something to support people. My bigger concern is that a text-dependent question way of teaching, at least in my view, is not actually teaching. Right? Like, I'm not giving you things that you can do beyond today. Because the standards are asking for independence in reading and writing, and the math standards as well, and the mathematical work that you do, which means that you have to learn a set of skills and habits that will support you in the work that you do in other texts beyond today. And so asking questions won't just do that by themselves. However, I don't think these are bad questions. Like, I think if you were to use this, what I might do is look at the sorts of things that you could be thinking about. Like, I mean, I'll be honest with you, before the standards, the only time I really did word work, like looking at words or looking at details in a text in that way, was during poetry studies with students. Maybe if we read plays together, but I didn't do an awful lot of like, let's study the word choices of authors, unless maybe there was like figurative language that jumped right out at you. So I think that is an awesome suggestion. I think that's really helpful. So what I'd say is study work like this, but then move from just telling to really teaching. So let me give you one example of that. Let's do a little quick lesson together. So this was aiming to do close reading, and there's an awful lot of products right now around the US. New York City has probably the most of them right now. They had a large program adoption that just happened, where every day you're supposed to do something that looks almost like this. My sweet 6-year-old daughter went through one of the programs that shall remain nameless. For 2 months was reading the same one picture book over and over and over and over and over again, and then had another one introduced to that. By the end, she knew that picture book really well, but I don't know that she came out of it with some skills that she could use in other text. So another way to go is this, where you teach 2 children. And so teaching 2 children oftentimes looks like this. Number 1, you have to be explicit. Right? Like, I have to teach you something. I have to let you know what I'm teaching and how it's going to go. Number 2, you need some time for practice. And number 3, you need an awful lot of time to do it yourself. So if we were to do close reading in that way, maybe it would go like this. So what I want to share with you is that we can make decisions about how we read. When we pick up a book, we can decide that we're going to read it just to get through the plot, or we're going to read it to just learn some new facts. Or we sometimes can decide that we're going to read carefully and closely to learn new ideas or have new reflections. So I want to teach you a way that you can do that. So a way that you can decide to read carefully and closely is first to decide you're going to stop and do it. And you don't always have to do it. It doesn't have to be every page, but you can decide there's a time you're going to stop and read and look carefully. And there's a few things you might do. Number 1, you might decide how you're going to read. In my book on close reading, we call it lenses. So you're going to decide what lens to read through. Then number 2, after you've read through that lens, you'll study what you found. You kind of look at it and look for patterns or figure out, is there something here that's really sticking out to me? And then have a new idea. Because ultimately, the work we're doing while we read is to have new ideas, to learn new things and have new experiences. So I want to try this with you. So I have a nonfiction text here. Here's A Black Hole is Not a Hole. Great. A Black Hole is Not a Hole by Carol D. Cristofano, illustrated by Michael Carroll. So A Black Hole is Not a Hole. So what I'd like to do is read just a little bit of A Black Hole is Not a Hole, and then we'll practice this. We're going to try it out. We're going to stop and decide what to read for. Then we'll reread looking for that thing. Then we'll stop and think, so do I notice patterns? Do I see something going on here? And then lastly, we'll have a new idea. So let's try it. Black hole is not a hole. Now, step one. I have chosen a text that I think you'll be highly engaged in. Because engagement is not just a thing, it's the only thing. Right? If no one's listening to you, it doesn't matter what you say. So I've picked a text to begin with that probably will matter to you. As we go, as your skills increase, as you have trust in me as your teacher, we can go to more complex reading. But for now, we'll start with this. Black hole is not a hole. Way out beyond where you are right now, beyond the clouds, beyond the moon, beyond Pluto, beyond our solar system, space goes on and on. You could travel for trillions of miles and you'd barely get to the closest star. In another few trillion miles, you might pass another star. Space is that huge. Way out there, trillions, quadrillions, and even more illions of miles away are special places called black holes. These places in space are special because of their power to pull on things. A black hole's pull is the strongest pull in the entire universe. Nothing can out-tug a black hole. No army of tow trucks, no convoy of supersized earth haulers, no fleet of giant rocket engines, not all of them combined. A black hole pulls in nearby dust. It pulls in nearby asteroids. It pulls in nearby stars and even nearby starlight. And no light, stars, asteroids, or dust comes out. Not ever. So could you stop here a minute and just briefly tell someone next to you what's an idea you're having about the text right now? Just whatever it is. Tell someone near you what's an idea that you're having. Okay, so we could come back together. We could come back together. So there's many reasons why we might go back to read a little bit more closely. We might reread because we're confused, right? We might go back and read more closely to understand something. We might go back because maybe we've come across a very descriptive section in nonfiction. And so we're like, oh, maybe I have to go back and really look at that description a bit more. Or maybe we're struck by an author's voice or tone, so we want to reread and kind of understand what's happening there. Maybe we want to read more like a writer and understand the craft that's happening. So there's many reasons why we might stop to reread. Let's reread this part. And as your teacher, I'm going to suggest that one way we can reread is to look for word choice, to look at the kinds of words that an author chose. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to reread it one more time. And could you, if you have something to jot on, jot. If not, you can finger type on your phone, or you can just point them out. Could you pay attention to some words that you think are choices? Words that it seems like this author put here for a purpose. And you can jot them down or hold on to them, because that's step one. We're making a decision to reread. We're deciding how we'll reread. I'm going to reread for words. Okay, here we go. Way out beyond where you are right now, beyond the clouds, beyond the moon, beyond Pluto, beyond our solar system. Like, one thing I'm noticing is the word beyond. I write that down because it's repeated over and over and over and over and over again. Beyond. Beyond Pluto, beyond our solar system, space goes on and on. I might write down on and on. You could travel for trillions of miles, and you'd barely get to the closest star. In another few trillion miles, you might pass another star. Space is that huge. Way out there, trillions, quadrillions, and even more illions of miles away are special places called black holes. These places in space are special because of their power to pull on other things. A black hole's pull is the strongest pull in the entire universe. Nothing can out-tug a black hole. No army of tow trucks, no convoy of supersized earth haulers, no fleet of giant rocket engines, like all of those too. I think I have to add those to my list. Not all of them combined. A black hole pulls in nearby dust, it pulls in nearby asteroids, it pulls in nearby stars and even nearby starlight, and no light, stars, asteroid, or dust comes out, not ever. So if I'm rereading and I'm looking for word choice, and I could choose other things, but I'm looking for word choice, step 2 that you could do with this text, or with really any text, is you can look over that list of things that you pulled out and look, are there patterns here? Are there things that stand out to you? And what I'd like you to look for, I'm going to ask you to talk about this with your partner. What's your list of words? What are some things that you're noticing? It could be patterns or things that pop out. What I want you to look for are ways that you can confirm or revise your first idea. So that first thing you said to your partner, wow, black holes are huge, you could then confirm it or revise it, maybe make it more specific, or adjust it if maybe you were a bit off the first time. So could you share with your partner that list that you have? And your goal now is to find things inside of it that confirm or revise your first idea. Go ahead. Okay, so we could come back together. So there's a couple more critical actions here that I want to point out to you. So number 1, most of the thinking was done by you, right? Like I wasn't standing up here saying, why was this particular word chosen? Now give me the correct answer for that. Instead, most of the thinking was done by you, because when you do most of the thinking, I can still learn from you. Critical action number 2 is I listened to you. Every time you turned and talked, I was going around listening to the conversations that you were having, because that's feedback to me. That's just like that asking kids to do the thing before you teach them. It's another way of doing the same thing, right? Like as you talked, I could listen for what ideas are you coming up with. Is there something I was unclear about? Do I have to add to that? And so if I'm promising to teach you, what I'm really promising to do is to give you time to think together and alone, give you time to practice, give you feedback, give you time and instruction that supports your work beyond this one text and beyond this one lesson. So here is, as we flip over, here is Brian, who's a administrator. No matter what the standards are, our focus is still on our students. I'm sorry, this is Brian, a education student. Not all of our students have been educated with such high standards as these, and by doing so, we're working together as a community of teachers and learners to build upon what our students already know and are already able to do. So the third promise we can make here is that I promise to allow you time to do, to allow you time to read, time to write, time to speak, time to listen. So for this time, I want to take up one big piece of time, which is practice. And the chunk of practice I'd like to spend a little time on is access. That access to the sorts of materials that support me in my practice is so hugely and critically important. And in particular, that's access to books. So the research around access to books is staggering and exciting and troubling. So there's things like, there's an incredibly high correlation between reading and test scores. Your scores go up as your reading goes up. And how does your reading go up? By reading more. If you happen to be a school or a district that's worried about test scores, and I can't imagine any of you feel that way, if you happen to be worried, the number one thing you need to do is ensure that your kids are reading as much as possible. There's a study of 70,000 families across 27 nations done in 2010 that looked at home access to books. And what they found in this study was that home access to books in terms of achievement levels was about equal to parents' level of education, was actually 2 times greater than father's occupation as an indicator in terms of achievement, was greater than family socioeconomic status as an indicator of achievement. Just access to books in homes. Children in homes that have a large book count are more likely to attend 3 additional years of school than students who don't. Or there's this, summer loss studies. Summer loss, we know, is a thing, it happens. And one thing that happens with summer loss is students who don't have access to books, it kind of goes like this, if we're graphing. So students that have a lot of access to books tend to make progress at about the same time as students without during the school year. And then over the summer, if you do have access to books, you either don't dip at all or you dip a bit. And if you don't have access to books, you tend to dip quite a lot. You can lose as much as 1 or 2 reading levels across the summer, about a level a month. And so what happens over time is that the students with very little access to books, the year is oftentimes making up just the amount of time that they lost over that summer. And so access to books, the amount of reading, oftentimes correlates to the widening achievement gap years down the line. So we need stuff. This is a middle school classroom in Queens where the entire school decided that they were going to have a competition to see who could get the most books, and they begged, borrowed, and steal. I'm telling you the truth. Like, there was some serious stuff going on. So this is one corner of Andrea Clavel's classroom, just one corner. And if you notice, she has an entire section for fantasy. It's not the shelf for fantasy. It's the entire section for fantasy. Here's another classroom in the same school where it's not just that there's some historical fiction books. There's an entire section of World War II historical fiction and nonfiction. Access to books really matters. This is East Campus High School in Northview, Michigan, a school that I wanted to cry and celebrate every second I was in that building. It's an alternative high school, and what's happening in Michigan is many alternative high schools are closing. Why? Because their test scores don't look very good. Because you have kids who have left school and now they've come back for a short amount of time, or they've been asked to leave, or they've been incarcerated, or many things have happened. And so what's happening in this district is that the superintendent, the principals decided that regardless of what happens to scores, they're not closing the school down. And the stories of kids in the school are incredibly powerful. Their shelves here are empty not because they don't have books, but because the kids are taking them home. Because I'm so moved by them, sent them a box of books a couple of weeks ago. And so my suggestion is that not only are we giving our own kids access to books, but we absolutely have to look at the school down the street and the school across town and the school in the next city over and say, do you have enough books too? In honor of access to books, I asked my friends at BookSource. I was coming here tonight. I know I'd talk some about books. So I asked my friends at BookSource. I said, so I'm going to talk about the importance of books. Do you think you might give some books to people maybe? And so BookSource generously has funded $1,000 worth of books. There's 3 people that are here tonight that will get some books. You're asked to write a little essay about it, and one person who's joining us online from the generosity of BookSource. And I want to point out that there's many organizations to support getting books in hands. And so if you have a classroom, reach out to organizations like these, including your public library. If you currently right now, and online as well, if you currently right now don't have your own classroom or you have a classroom that's full of books, I'd ask that you donate to organizations like these, or you find schools that are near you that you can give books to, that the Common Core standards aren't just about the standards. They're about the ways that we as educators come together to support every child. Here's Ben, a principal. The Common Core is still too broad for me. There's a lack of spiraling, which makes me wonder about the validity, but I still see it as very broad. If teachers try to master or dig deeper on every standard, they'll move too slow. In some ways, it feels like a rat race. So what did we at my school, at his school, do? Well, this week we began to take positive steps forward. Ben has made promises like these. And the last promise, the promise that I make to you, that I make to your students, and I know we make to each other, is that I promise to learn from you, for you, and to fight for your future. Educators across 45 states are openly sharing ideas, increasing their knowledge of skills needed for students, and work very long and very hard to provide quality instruction for all students. Our students are our curriculum. Earlier, I talked about promises. This is a Dharma doll out of, it's a Buddhist group in Japan that they have these dolls. And what they do with the dolls is at the start of the new year, you can go to a temple and you can get one of these dolls. And if you notice, the doll has only one eye filled in. Because you get that doll and you make a promise or a goal, something that you will do that year, and you color in one eye. And then you place it somewhere where you and other people visiting can see it. It's a reminder every time you see that doll that you haven't yet finished that promise or goal. Once you've fulfilled that goal or promise that you have, then you color the other eye in. It's a way that you tell yourself and those around you that you've achieved something important. At the end of the year, everyone brings their dolls together and they have a bonfire. They let those promises from the year go, not to say, great job, I did it, we're done, I did the thing I had to do, but instead to say, I'm ready to make a new one. So what I'd like to end with is, well, first this, Chris saying, look at Pinterest, Facebook, or Twitter to find creative ideas of how you can use objects in useful ways. Tires become planters, candy containers become a filing system. Whether it's the Common Core or anything else, one has to look for the sunshine instead of just the clouds. What I'd like to end with before we turn to some questions is if you could think about some of these things that you already know how to do, and could you share with someone near you what's a promise that you want to make beyond today? So share a promise with someone near you, and then we'll turn to some questions at the end. Go ahead. Okay, everyone, if we could come back together. If we could come back together. So we have a bit of time here now. We can switch to questions from the audience. We also will take some questions virtually as well from the chat that we have going on now. So I'll turn it over to you, and we have a mic in the audience. Okay, perfect. Yes, here's a.
Let me come over.
Sure.
Actually, I wasn't going to have a question, but so I teach teachers, and I teach them a lot of the things that you talk about, so it's gratifying to hear that. But I want to make a comment about what you said earlier about our profession, and this is a comment I make to my people too, is that if you look at other professions, like a doctor, for example, we don't just drop our kids off at the clinic and say send them home when they're well.
Right.
Okay, so with doctors, we have doctors develop relationships with parents. And in education, and so I taught in high school and I worked in middle schools and so forth, and especially there, it's like we don't have those relationships with parents. And maybe Common Core standards are a tool that we can use to communicate our agreements and our disagreements and what we should be doing. And maybe parents have good ideas about that we should also be making part of the conversation. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I tend to say whatever amount of parental involvement you think you have at your school, multiply it by 5, right? For I think the very reason that you said. I've recently been doing some work with they used to be the National Center for Family Literacy, and they've just recently changed their name to the National Center for Families Learning. It's a group out of Washington, D.C., NCFL. They have a great conference, and they've done a lot of research and work around that and really tried to support policy around how are schools making connections with families and helping entire families learn and grow. And I think you're absolutely right. As a parent of children in public school, I've also experienced how we all, and I think those of you that are parents or know children that they're in school too, there's a vacuum that we want to fill until you help us fill it. So I am a literacy person, but when it comes to math, I know very, very little. It's a very sad amount. So I'm desperate to know about her math program, the math standards, what's going on with math. And so I think you're absolutely right, that the sorts of things that we're doing to inquire about our own conversations, we need to reach out to families as well. And I think it's as small as making sure every unit of study that we go into, we're sending home to parents some like, here's what you can ask to your kids, or here are the sorts of things we're making. I think there tends to be a large drop-off of that as kids go up grades. I think kindergarten teachers are awesome at that, and then it doesn't always carry all the way through, and I'm guilty of it too when I taught the upper grades. But I also, and I'll say I haven't really thought about this in the way that you suggested. I think it's a brilliant point of involving parents and helping us think about problem solving around the standards too. I think about the field of working with students on the autism spectrum and how many times the most important thing that you can do when you work with students who are along the spectrum is to talk to their families first, to say what are the things that you've learned that you know about your kids. So I think it's a brilliant point. Thank you.
I have the next question.
Okay.
It is from our virtual audience. How should teachers check for students' understanding when reading in high school?
Excellent. Okay, how should, seems like a loaded question, person online. No, that's a great question. So how should teachers check for understanding of reading? So what I'm going to say right now is perhaps a little bit controversial, and so, well, there you go. Here we go. So I think based on the things that we talked about with reading ability, matching students to books that they can read well, and I don't mean reading level as a prison. Like I think if you say you can only read this particular level, now you're stuck. I think reading levels are an invitation. They shouldn't be a prison. But I do think if your high school curriculum is built around books, not kids, if when you look at your curricular map, it says The Great Gatsby, and it like goes through texts, and it's not about skills or students, then I'd say it probably is very hard to know their reading understanding, because you're kind of confined to their engagement with that text. Penny Kittle does a fabulously incredible work with high school readers, and one thing that she does is she teaches, she coaches, and she consults as well, is she'll ask her students to kind of lay out for her the number of books they read each year. She has these brilliant videos online on her blog. It's like pennykittle.net, I think, where she has, like, there's one girl who she has, 9th grade, she read 4 books the whole year. And then 10th grade, she read 4 books the whole year. And then 11th grade, she read 5 books the whole year. And then in 12th grade, when she entered a classroom where choice was as important as teaching texts, she read like 37 books that year. And what Penny talks about and she shows is that as students move across more text, their own level of complexity and independence grows from there too. That she really did read more and more complicated text for her because she read more. So I think we check for understanding, number one, by having more text that kids are connected and engaged to. And I think number two, it's offering up multiple opportunities for them to talk about text or write about text. I think if you don't have kids write about their reading in some way, and I don't mean book reports. You could, fine, if book reports are your thing, fine. But in short ways that they're jotting about text, you get no feedback to yourself other than their eyes on a book. So that's one suggestion I'd say. I'd look at Penny Kittle's book, Book Love, I think is another great start as well.
Another question here.
Chris, first of all, I just want to thank you for your work. In case you feel disengaged from students in classroom, I just want you to know that your work really does impact a lot of students and teachers that you probably never see, so I really appreciate you tonight. But my question is around teachers planning for instruction. I work with a network of school leaders in Milwaukee, and a lot of what you're saying makes sense, and the school leaders really value these concepts, but it gets much more complicated as teachers begin to do the work in planning, and you touched on that briefly tonight when you talked about teachers being overwhelmed by paperwork and planning rather than the actual joy of teaching. Yeah. So much of what you're talking about is selecting appropriate texts that engage students and planning around the skills that students really need to develop and knowing the needs of a wide range of students, and that is very time-consuming. Yet, conversely, sometimes ineffective teachers, one of the reasons why they're struggling is because they're not properly planned for instruction. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what effective planning looks like based on some of the concepts that you talked about tonight.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the comment as well. So the one thing I'll say is, I was working with Teachers College. We had a strong connection to CPRE. It's the Consortium for Policy Research and Education. It's a group, UW-Madison School of Ed is part of that as well, and Columbia, a bunch of other universities. And so one of the heads of CPRE at Teachers College, Tom Corcoran, who's brilliant scientist himself and researcher, he said something that really stuck with all of us that I think is one part of the answer, is he said, first of all, what you said, the amount of time and people that it takes to create really thoughtful, well-organized, designed curricula is absurdly overwhelming. At the Reading and Writing Project, whose work I'm biased, but I think is really well done, it's taken, every year we wrote a new curriculum, we'd revise our curriculum, there were about 60 of us on staff. It took us 3 solid months, and those 3 months of just writing and revising and piloting didn't include all of the months and years that went before it. So I think on the one hand, to expect every single teacher to do just what you said of like, now produce your curriculum is sort of absurd. Like you don't have the time to do all those things. So Tom's suggestion, he said, I really think that what it comes down to is choosing high quality curricular materials. And I say that with the biggest star flashing underline, like it's got to be high quality materials, and then supporting teachers and staff in collaborating around revising those materials based on kids. Right? So it's not just about producing new stuff. Now, that doesn't mean everyone should have that. Like there's middle school, high school in Upper Manhattan that has had a relationship with the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project for years, and they've gotten to the point where they start to make many of their own units. But they've also had that practice of curricular creation. So I think that would be my one really main suggestion is to find materials that you feel already match the needs of your kids. And then together your work is really collaborating around looking at 1 or 2 pieces of kid work and revising what's coming up next. I think that feedback loop is much more doable than trying to take it all on. That said, my wife has right now what I would consider low quality instructional materials, and she's spending past midnight every night trying to figure out how her English language learning students are going to master this material that's way above them. And that's just a drain on time and resources too. I'm sure there's a longer conversation than that, but I hope that helps.
So we have time for about 2 more questions. There's a young woman over there in the burgundy.
Yay, this side, yay.
Hi, I'm a teacher with Simpson Street Free Press. We're an out-of-school time academic after-school program. And in fact, a lot of our curriculum really well aligns with the Common Core. And I was wondering if you could comment, what are your thoughts about out-of-school time learning, and how can out-of-school time programs support education in school?
My thoughts on that are complex. As a parent, young parent, my eldest is in 1st grade, my son's in pre-K, so we're new to this. I have completely rethought homework and home time because I feel what it feels like on the other side, which now I look back at all the years that I was teaching, I'm like, what was I doing? What was I thinking? Like, why was I so obsessed with it? So what I will say is I don't know the answers to homework, and I don't think your question is just homework. So I'll say I don't know the answers to homework. There's a lot of research and debate happening now about what's right, what's not right. I will say clearly the percentage of time that our kids spend away from school is greater than the percentage of time that they spend in school. If you equate all the hours together, there's an awful lot of time that they aren't inside of the school building. And so I think part of it goes back to the first question, the first comment about what's parental involvement, how are we supporting parents. I will say like summer loss, there's research around if kids aren't reading or aren't in an organized activity that uses their mind, summer loss occurs. But if they're reading and or doing some organized sorts of activity, it supports it. So I'd say I have mixed opinions because I'm not yet certain what I believe in terms of extended time. Like I don't know how I feel about extended day schools or extended across the year. There's part of me that I feel like let kids be kids. Like a big part of what makes me me is that I also ran around a lot, So I'd say additional time. Maybe my answer is clear this way. I think additional time, if our additional time programs look like tutoring for homework that's too hard for kids already, they're not useful. Right? Like if the work that we're doing with kids beyond the school day is just to help them do the thing that the school day work couldn't already do, I think then we're just adding a burden onto kids even more. If instead our additional school time is building on strengths that kids already have or building other components that their school day doesn't have, I'd say that to me makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I'll admit I'm not an expert on extended time. I have very mixed feelings about it. But thank you. Thank you for your question. Okay, all right. Thank you all very much. Thank you.